I'm Tony Lockwood, founder of Thompson Wright Partners, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest episode of Inside Track, where I discuss business transformation journeys with leading figures in industry. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Steve Baker. I've known Steve for a couple of years, and every time we meet up I feel energised and believe that anything is possible. Although Steve operates in the transformation space, he is unlike all of the other people that we've had on the podcast, in that the transformation that he delivers is on individuals and communities rather than organisations. However, as I've said so many times to him before, I absolutely believe 100% that his approach, which has been successful in many different arenas, is absolutely transferable to corporate life. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of interference on the line in places, so hopefully this will not affect your enjoyment of the show. With that, I'm delighted to introduce you to Steve Baker. Welcome to the Inside Track podcast. Great to have you on board.
Thank you very
Steve
much.
Baker OBE. That's, since we set up the date for recording the episode and the actual recording, you've obviously been awarded the OBE, so many congratulations on that. How did that make you feel?
Incredibly excited, and then I realised I was going to be out of pocket because I've got two very excited little girls who want to know whether they can have new dresses for the visit to the palace. It's going to cost me a fortune, but yeah, it was incredible.
And do you have a date as yet for going down, or is it COVID dependent at the moment?
It's all COVID dependent. Ordinarily, you go down within 6 months of being given the honour, but that's just going to depend on restrictions.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Good. So well, make sure that you get them the two nice dresses.
I certainly will. My 5-year-old asked if she can wear nail varnish as well, so that's another problem I've got to tackle.
Growing up far too quickly.
Absolutely.
So most of the people that we have on these podcasts have had significant experience in delivering organisational change and transformation. You're a little different, but as we've discussed many times before, I think what you do is so transferable into the corporate world. So I was keen to get you on to share your experience. So do you want to just give us a brief summary of your career to date? And that'll give us the context of the conversation.
Probably take up the entire podcast. So going back over 20-25 years, I was originally a war crimes investigator for the United Nations. So I worked as a forensic anthropologist, exhuming war graves and performing autopsies to investigate the genocide in Bosnia. Fast forward a little bit, came back into the UK. I spent time traveling all around the world, but when I was UK based, I worked in recruitment and did fairly well there. But then I decided I wanted to make a difference, so I entered the world of education. Within a couple of years, I moved into headship, and I've led 3 different schools to outstanding judgments. As a head teacher, I was an Ofsted inspector as well. I now sit on various boards, and I do research, and I put that into practice, looking at neuroscience and psychology. We focus very much on motivation, and we remove non-confrontational approaches to how we modify behaviour, because the schools I lead all take the most challenging kids. So they are all excluded from mainstream provision. They're either pupil referral units, or the 2 schools I now have are special schools for children with social, emotional and mental health difficulties. And then the last 18 months or so, I am now seconded 50% of my time away from the 2 schools I run into a position with a collective impact initiative charity called Right to Succeed, who look at place-based change on a huge scale. So we're looking at change right across an entire community now over the next 20 to 25 years, which is being funded by some key philanthropists, including a billionaire. So that's it in a nutshell.
That's in a nutshell. And you've very quickly gone over that experience there, aren't you? And but I was particularly interested to really understand how you define transformation in your world, and because you do transform lives in many different ways. How would you define transformation?
The way that we look at transformation, if you use a school example, we look at trying to change children's behaviour. So we have children who can be potentially very violent and aggressive, who have a range of additional needs, including things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, children on the autism spectrum disorder. And what we look to do is transform their behaviour. So we don't do that in the short term. We don't use punishment. So we've moved away from punitive measures, and we've moved away from sanctions. So a dictionary definition of a sanction is the implied threat of a punishment. And we moved away from that. So we look at trying to modify behaviour and transform behaviour over the long term through using rewards-based systems and effective intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. So that's on an individual basis in terms of transformation. In terms of broader transformation, it's about making things better, I would say. So looking at it from a school perspective, the schools that I've led, I've moved to outstanding, which is the highest judgment that Ofsted can give us, and that's despite my schools being funded in the bottom 10%. We perform in the top 10% nationally, funded in the bottom 10%. My secondary school is less than half the minimum recommended size for a special school, and we've not had any additional funding to change our staffing. I've just tried to optimize what we have and get people to work together really effectively. And we've transformed the culture within the schools to move them. I work in the prison estate as well. I've worked with prison governors across the country, helping them undertake transformational change in the justice system. And now, in terms of the transformational change, we're looking at working right across the North Birkenhead area, which is being recognised as one of the top 5 most socioeconomically deprived areas in the country. If you look at the indices of deprivation, spanning back to when they started in 2002, there are only 5 neighbourhoods in the country that have ranked in the top 100 most deprived, and North Birkenhead's one of them, consistently in there. Yeah. So one of the top 5 most deprived. And what we're looking to do in terms of transformational changes is change the children's life chances over a series of generations. So a 20-year project to close attainment gaps, to improve educational attainment, educational progress, improve literacy skills, tackle antisocial behaviour across the piece. And so transform an entire community using a place-based change model.
Right, interesting. And going back to the start of that, you're talking about the behavioural change element and how you have moved away from a discipline to an incentive type of approach. And I think that is absolutely transferable into the corporate world. Can you just go a little bit deeper on that in terms of how you've done that and what the reaction has been and how people have adapted, both your staff and the children themselves?
Yeah, so I looked at different styles of leadership, and there's a psychologist called McGregor, and he said there are 2 styles. There's an X or a Y style. So an X style is very much based around the people who work for you need to be directed. They need to be given direct commands. They need to be in effect punished, although they don't want to be there. They don't want to be doing the job. You've got to constantly micromanage them. And then the Y style of leadership he postulated was all around taking people on a journey, giving them a vision, using extrinsic motivators that will ultimately impact on them so they are intrinsically motivated to do well. So in terms of how we've gone about the change, I mean, I don't want to go too scientific on you, but my background's science. I've got a couple of master's degrees, and one of them's around educational leadership, and we do a lot of research. So I sit on the board of a neuroscience think tank called Learnus, and we look at how we can take neuroscientific research and put it into education, put it into practice. So the model we use it's called Hebbian theory, and it's all about how your brain is transformed and how you can create new neuronal architecture through the use of effective rewards. So if I'm going to put it really bluntly, if you see positive behavior and you reward it, that behavior is more likely to be repeated, and then you strengthen that neural pathway, and then if you reward it again, you strengthen it further, and ultimately it just becomes either an intrinsic motivator or it becomes a habit. Yeah. And people work much more effectively to rewards. Now, I said a little bit earlier, that my schools are funded in the bottom 10% in the country. When I say rewards, it doesn't mean something huge like taking them off on a holiday to Disney World. It just means catching them doing something right, and rewarding them with some praise. It can be a well done, it could be written praise. Pardon?
It's like acknowledging the fact that they've done something.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And then, and if someone is doing something good and you praise them for it, because we are social creatures. I've just had a book published all about this. We are social creatures. If you acknowledge and praise someone for doing something, the people around them are going to want to do it as well, because they see someone else getting praise and they want that praise. And it starts to create this snowball effect.
So how does that sit with the pain gain approach, where people either are motivated to move away from pain or motivated to move towards gain? And there is this sort of theory, isn't there, that you're more motivated to move away from pain than you are to move towards gain.
There are a couple of different things. If someone feels that they're unable to move away from pain, it's not effective anymore. So you get this state of learned helplessness, which is, there's a psychologist called Seligman, who's the founder of positive psychology, and he talks a lot about learned helplessness. So you can't actually move away from the pain. But what we're seeing actually is the implied threat of a punishment isn't effective. That's why our prisons are full. So punishment doesn't work. I've not gone out this morning and I've not robbed a bank because I think, I'm going to get punished for it. It's because I know it's deep down it's wrong. It's not the right thing to rob a bank. Whereas if you want someone to consistently repeat positive behaviors, you're much more likely to get that if you reward them effectively. So punishment, or the threat of punishment, it may work for people, but there are a significant minority of people which are, and those sorts of people actually happen to form the majority of the students in my schools, but a significant minority of the general population, they are not affected by the threat of punishment, but everyone is affected by rewards. So you're more likely to get people to do the right thing by rewarding them. So we look at going back to an individual basis of behavioural change. We look at trying to change the individual over time. I'm not saying a reward will make someone choose the right behaviour after a week or after a month, but over time and a repetition of those positive behaviours, you're more likely to get a long-term change. And that's all based on this theory of neuroscience called Hebbian theory.
If you translate that into the corporate world, where people are, as you're driving through transformation, we use the terminology just like you do. You need to take people on that journey, utilizing positive reinforcements and positive behaviors and acknowledging when people have done good is definitely a way of helping people transition. One of the challenges, having said that, sometimes is just taking all the core stakeholders on that journey as well. In terms of your experience of your sort of core stakeholders within the education or in the prison environment, how have you taken them on that journey, and how have you found that they've reacted and adapted to your approach?
It's an interesting one. So about 5 years ago, I was asked to take over a school that was under threat of closure, and there was a 6-month police investigation. And so it was probably in as bad a place as you could imagine, as far as an education establishment is concerned. So in order to turn it around, which we did, within 2 years, we had an Ofsted inspection and we moved from closure to outstanding in all areas. We didn't have a new set of staff. It was the same group of people. And there's a couple of theories now. Obviously, in the corporate world, you use a lot of different theories of change, and so the theories of change that I used in particular in my schools, and I've supported prison governors to use, one which you'll know of, which is Cotter and his 8-step cycle. So, and the second one was Appreciative Inquiry by Cooper Ryder. Right. So Cotter, the first 3 stages of Cotter's 8-step cycle to cultural change. The first one is create a sense of urgency. So that wasn't a problem because, the school was under threat of closure. And then the second one was about creating a team of people who you felt would be able to drive that change forward. Yeah. So when I first arrived at the primary school, one member of staff took me to one side and told me to F off. So what do you know about primary? And I said, I don't. I said, but I know about leadership. And, if you trust me, I'll support you. I'm not going to vilify you. I'm not going to accuse you of anything. I'll work with you and we will make this better. So I looked at Cotter's cycle. I got the leadership team on board. The head had been removed. The deputy head had been removed. The business leader left. The board of governors all were removed. And several of the senior staff had left within the previous 6 months. So I had a very new senior leadership team. I took in two other people with me, and we created a team. We had that sense of urgency. And then what I did is I engaged all the stakeholders. So all of the staff, any of the parents who had taught to us, the new board of governors, the pupils, and we started to create a vision on what we were trying to achieve. So that was going on one path. Running parallel to that, I used the appreciative inquiry by Cooper Ryder. So if you go into an institution and you look to create change, the first thing most people do is look at what's not working. But I didn't want to do that because, the staff in the school had already been vilified. They were under a lot of pressure. So I went in and I said, listen, what's working? So I did lots of different questionnaires and stakeholder meetings and met people individually in small groups and said, tell me what works really well so we can do more of that. Then we created a system where I could have short-term wins, medium-term wins, and long-term wins, because initially I was only seconded into the school for 9 months. That's 5 years ago now. And so what I could do is I asked people, if you were in charge, what would you do? And some of it was nonsensical, but some of it was absolutely golden. So I took those little golden nuggets, and some of them were dead easy to put in place. So within the first month of all those meetings taking place, I just did a very basic you said, we did exercise. And I said, you said this, we did this. And they could start to see tangible change themselves. And within a month, you could feel the tide starting to turn, and people were on board, started to believe what we did. Then after about 6 weeks, we created a new vision, an entire new vision and set of core principles for the school. And every key decision we made, we cross-referenced with that vision and set of principles. Do we want to do this? Well, let me just check on the vision. Do we want to? And so everyone knew what we were trying to achieve. The first 3 months were hellish. Don't believe everything people tell you about school holidays. They don't really exist. And after about 6 months, we could really see the change. 12 months later, I felt that we were moving into a really good place. And within 2 years, we were outstanding in all areas. And we were used by the Department for Education as an exemplar in terms of best practice and how we treat our staff and promote mental health and well-being.
Great. And I suspect then in those first 3 months, as you're saying, were really hellish. Part of that would have been, that team will have been beaten up so many times previously about getting things wrong. They had to. They were probably even thinking you were just trying to trick them by going in and saying what were you doing well or what was going well. So you had to turn that around and build the trust up almost.
Absolutely. I think, and the way that we did it, because what we'd done so effectively in my previous schools, I introduced the coaching culture. But interestingly, coaching moved from the corporate world into the education world around 2000, and I've done some research into it, but I didn't use coaching to inform pedagogy or how to teach, so we didn't look at it for a work-based system. What I did is I introduced coaching for a couple of reasons. The first being to create really, really effective lines of communication between the team. The second, I introduced a non-hierarchical system. So I was being coached by an unqualified teacher, and my deputy was being coached by a teaching assistant. So we said, listen, it's a flattened hierarchy. There are lines of accountability and responsibility, but ultimately we all have equal voice in this, and we can all hold each other to account. So people started to believe in that. And the coaching also allowed us to focus on resilience, and we do a lot of work around emotional resilience and well-being, because my wife says happy wife, happy life. I say happy staff, happy kids, better outcomes. It's not hard. So that's we worked it. We spend most of our waking lives in work, so we might as well enjoy it while we're there.
But I think that what you're just saying is really interesting, though, that you were saying that you introduced the coaching culture, but in a completely different way than most organisations will ever do it. And you turned it on its head to say, actually, we're going to be coaching each other rather than those accountability sessions between each other, irrespective of the hierarchy within the organisation. So did you give them some sort of coaching skills training beforehand, or was it some, you know, how did you implement that? Because that would have, I would have thought would be quite challenging for some people to take on initially, you know, maybe a relatively junior member coaching you, for instance.
Yeah, I'm quite lucky because in addition to the headship roles I've got, I do a lot of consultancy work. So I do a lot of public speaking. So I go in and I train other school leaders on cultural change, on motivation, on how to change, modify behaviours. And one of the things that I train people on is coaching.
Right.
So I've done a big piece of research into coaching. I've done a master's in it, and I didn't want people to get sick of me, but just to go back a bit, I have some credibility in my school. So when I first started teaching, I arrived in the school where I initially took on my headship. There was a sweepstake on how long I'd last, because
Right.
it is a challenging environment when children and young adults are very violent and aggressive, and they thought I wouldn't last very long. And ironically, I went back as the head. So they'd seen me move right through the system. But I wanted an external source to come in and do the coaching training initially, so it wasn't just all about me talking to them. But because I had trained up other schools, I could just constantly chip away and give them more professional development opportunities and remind them of key coaching skills. So we used the GROW model, just kept it nice and simple. And one of the things that we made sure that we did is get the contracting right at the beginning, so people knew that it would be confidential. And that's one of the reasons why we chose not to look at informing our practice or pedagogy. We looked at coaching as a tool to really give us a solution focus, but for ourselves, so we could look at what was impacting us, because mental health doesn't stop at the workplace and at home. It all blends into one. So I said to people, I don't care what you talk about. Those coaching conversations are absolutely confidential. Just come with a problem and talk it through with someone in absolute confidence. And so we paid a sharp focus on developing emotional resilience and emotional intelligence, looking at the work of Goleman and his emotional intelligence, his work. You know, what we do can be incredibly challenging. So we work with some of the most disadvantaged young people in the most disadvantaged areas in the UK. And people talk about empathy, but empathy in our line of work can be aversive. You can start taking on all those emotions and it can impact your own well-being. So we looked at trying to change that empathy into compassion, which is a more of a friend of mine used to describe it as loving action. You see injustice and you want to tackle it. And you know, a lot of my willingness to tackle injustice goes all the way back to the very beginning and my war crimes work.
Yeah. Now, I was going to come back to that actually, because that I know when we've had conversations in the past, that's informed a massive amount of what you've gone on to do, hasn't it? You know, that I remember you saying on the first time we met that what you came away from Bosnia and really wanted to understand how people could have gone and done the types of things that you can't even, you know, if you've not been there, you can't even imagine the sort of stuff that you've seen. But you wanted to understand how they could have got to that stage to do and take the actions that they took.
Absolutely. And that's what drove me to go into education, because early intervention is more effective than remedial action, and education and remembrance are the only way that we can tackle these sorts of issues. And the thing that gets me is if you look at any genocide in history, you look at the Holocaust, you look at the Bosnian genocide, the genocide over in Rwanda, the stock take when you're sitting at home and you're watching this on the news is, oh, aren't they evil? And people fall into the trap of thinking that only evil people can perpetrate really horrific acts, but it's not true. ordinary people were involved in the genocide, and so that's what led me to try and do more work to tackle hatred and work with the most challenging and disadvantaged kids back in the UK, because who was it who said, it was a parliamentarian, I forgot who it was who said, all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing.
Yeah.
And so I now sit on the board of a charity called Remembrance Srebrenica, and we do a lot of work. I speak at Holocaust Memorial Day events about the Bosnian genocide. I speak in schools, I speak in prisoners about the ultimate consequences of hatred if we leave it to go unfettered and unchecked. And it can lead into genocide. Now, there's been a big piece of research looking at the stages of genocide, 1 to 10. But the 10th stage of genocide actually being denial, which we're seeing a lot now.
Right.
But you consider those 10 stages, you could argue quite easily that we're probably on stage 4, 5, or 6 in the Western world at the moment, in the States, and some of the prevalence of the hate speech, right-wing hate speech in particular, and in the UK as well, and some of the things that are going on. So that drove me to want to make a difference. And again, initially when I was a science teacher, I'd go and talk about the forensics behind the genocide, but now I talk about the psychology of it and what led up to the Bosnian genocide, and actually what we can do to try and stop it from happening again.
Yeah. And what are the sort of top 2 or 3 things that you think we should be doing now then, given if you think that we're at sort of 5 or 6 on that sort of 1 to 10 scale? I was having a chat with a friend of ours over the weekend, and we're talking about some of the hate that comes across in social media, and Twitter in particular. You probably never say to the person face to face, but because they are hidden behind a username, then you seem to be quite happy to say something. And I'm not for 1 minute saying that's anywhere near that sort of, but it's just indicative of this sort of world that we're living in at the moment.
Absolutely. So Remembrance Srebrenica, this year is the 25th anniversary of the genocide. I was due to be back in Sarajevo. I was going to lead a delegation to educate the delegates about the genocide and what happened, and actually take them to Potocari and to Srebrenica where it took place. And the charity this year, their theme is called Every Action Matters, and that's what we can do. Take an action, no matter how small, because you're right. What we need to do is stand up and speak out, and you see, you mentioned it on social media in particular. Right-wing hate speech is prevalent. You look at the massacres and the killings at the mosques in Christchurch, and as the perpetrator was driving to the mosques, he was listening to Serb propaganda songs on the radio. And what we need to do is we need to learn from what's happened, and we need to remember what's happened and make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again. But unfortunately, never again seems to be turning into yet again. So I think in terms of actions, what we need to do is every time that we hear that sort of speech mentioned and we see it on social media, we need to stand up and speak out and protect the people who are being victimised.
Yeah, but that's easier said than done, isn't it? Because, especially on social media, I know we're going down a massive different tangent here, but on social media in particular, if you stand up and call out these people, you it's not uncommon for you to be absolutely battered by their sympathisers coming after you, type of stuff, and that can have a big impact on individuals as well.
Absolutely. It's amazing, as you say, it's amazing social media. The things that you'd say on that 50 years ago you never dared, or 20 years ago, 10 years ago, you never dared to say to someone in the pub. It's frightening what people get away with now, but there are other ways to try and tackle it by reporting it and whatnot. I wouldn't suggest that you try and take it head on, but sometimes maybe that is the right thing to do, because we're letting too many people get away with too much, and it's frightening the direction of travel that we're going in. There are worrying times ahead.
No, absolutely. So bringing it back into sort of the transformation space in your school now, where something happened that is not acceptable, or in prison when you're working with a prison population, something happens that's not acceptable. What are the stages that you would typically go through to try to turn that sort of behaviour around? I'm just trying to think, align it to maybe some lessons that we can take into the corporate world.
Yeah, so people often think that when I talk about removing sanctions, that we just don't have any consequences at all. That's absolutely not true. You know, in the corporate world, out in the public world, every action that you take, there's going to be an ultimate consequence to that action. So we do have consequences for the actions. What we try and do is we try and get people to understand their behaviours and what are driving them. So, for example, with children and young people, if someone's in crisis and they are agitated and they are trashing a classroom and throwing things around, what you don't want to do is try and sit them down over a cup of tea and have a chat about it at the time, because obviously they're in crisis and it takes a long time to de-escalate those sorts of behaviours. But once someone is thinking rationally again, that's when you need to be speaking to them to understand what is making them behave in that way. So we try and come at it from a place of understanding. Before we begin any conversation, we don't always need to win that conversation. It's not a battleground. So it's the same, I imagine, in the corporate world. If you go in, when I was an Ofsted inspector, if I went in and inspected a lesson, I was observing it, and I wanted to see whether that person was an effective teacher. They've changed the way they do lesson observations now. What we didn't start with afterwards when we were giving feedback is tell me how you think that went, because you could end up with a nightmare scenario. They think it was absolutely amazing and actually it was a car crash lesson.
Yeah.
So what we do is we just try and get people to talk to us about what they were thinking at the time when those behaviours were taking place, and then we try and get them to understand why they're just not acceptable behaviours and what the consequences will be in the outside world.
Is that about identifying the trigger events that's causing them to go down the particular route?
Absolutely. So if you look at someone with incredibly challenging behaviour, something is driving that. We see those behaviours as a form of communication. And what I'm not saying is that we accept those behaviours and we approve of them. We may not approve of them, but we want to know what's driving them. Because ultimately, let's say my primary school as an example. I can manage the behaviour in a class of primary age children, 7, 8-year-olds. I'm a fairly big scouser. I could walk in and scream at them and shout at them. Is that acceptable? No. I could make them do what I want because I'm a pretty scary bloke if I wanted to be. Is that right? No. What I want to do is get them to understand those behaviours and change them over the long term. And if someone is misbehaving, I want to find out why, what's driving that. You know, if we just take a classic example on the news today, looking at child poverty and hunger, you know, over 50% of the kids in the wards that we take them from are living in child poverty, and some of them are very, very hungry. Now, if you transpose that onto Maslow's hierarchy and look at self-actualization at the top, and at the very bottom is having your basic needs met. Yeah. If that child's hungry, if I'm hungry, if I'm tired, like I was yesterday because I was waking up at 6:15, if I'm hungry and I'm tired, I'm not acting rationally, I'm not behaving well. So what we try and do is make sure that we can get some of those basic elements in place first. So we'll feed the kids when they come into school in the morning. We'll talk to them, we'll find out what sort of place they're in. And I think we try and base it. I'm going to paraphrase this and it's going to be slightly wrong, but Mandela said no one's born evil, and if you can learn to hate, you can be taught to love. And that's what we're trying to do with these kids. Yeah. We understand some of them have got really challenging home lives. Some of them have had really challenging upbringings, but we're not judging them. Every day is a fresh start. We will try and work with them again, and over time, by rewarding the positive behaviours that we want to see, we'll get them to repeat them, and eventually they'll repeat them consistently, and it'll become a habit, and they'll make better choices. And it does work over the long term.
Yeah, it reminds me actually, a couple of weeks ago we had Mike Geacock, who I've known for 20, 30 years or so, worked with him for many years, and one of his key phrases is, no one cares about what you know, until they know that you care. And there's an element of
Yeah.
that in there. It's really about getting into their world, understanding what their situation is, and then guiding them and helping them along the path that you want to take. But until you're really in their space and understand where they are in their mind, that you can't start to make that personal transformation. And it's exactly the same in the corporate world.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the corporate world, I imagine it would be, and having worked in different sectors previously, including recruitment, and I did well when I was working in that. Everything comes down to one key skill. That's communication, effective communication. And as well as being able to communicate effectively with the kids, I need to communicate effectively with the staff or the stakeholders, parents, other agencies. It all comes down to talking to people openly, honestly, understanding them and what place they're coming from, but also actively listening to them, because I know it's a habit that a lot of people get into, and they don't really listen to what you're saying. They're just waiting for you to stop talking so they can take their turn. So we also use the coaching skills once we'd embedded it for improving our skill set as a staff and for supporting each other in terms of emotional resilience. We started using it with the children, and it developed organically from there. So we just asked them lots of really effective open questions, and then they give us lots and lots of information. So everything boils down to effective lines of communication and support.
Obviously, you've seen that a big impact upon the behaviours of the children in the schools that you're working with. But in terms of how they develop and how they go forward, that's a real skill set that you're giving them that will make a difference for the rest of their life. Do you get a feel that they're understanding that and they're getting that and actually incorporating and integrating that into the way that they sort of move forward in their life? Or are they a bit too young? I'm not too sure what the ages are.
Yeah, so I originally had a secondary school, so 11 to 16 boys only. Then the primary school I took over was boys and girls, and they come in really age 6 through to 11. And it depends on how long they're with you, because it's quite a transient population sometimes. So if they're excluded from mainstream school, then they end up in one of my schools. We mightn't get them to year 10 or even the back end of year 11. So we aren't able to have a lot of impact with them. But what they always understand is that we'll talk to them. So no matter what age they come into us, we develop relationships. Now, my staff are aware we develop really effective relationships with the kids, but the professional relationships, we are not their friends, but we are friendly. And it's the same in the corporate world. You might not want to be mates with the team that you're working with, but you want to be friendly to them, and you're more likely to develop a sense of team. When we were doing that quarter cycle, not the primary school, my secondary school that I've been at for quite some time, is we didn't really have the sense of urgency, but in terms of timings, but we had a sense of urgency because we were so badly funded, we could have been heading towards a deficit budget. So what the coaching system and creating these really strong links within the team and a flattened hierarchy allowed us to do is create if you forgive the footballing analogy, create an old crazy gang Wimbledon football club style of thinking. So no one likes us, everyone hates us, we don't care. We're going to do the right thing for these kids, and we're going to do it well. And so what everyone who's ever visited my schools has said is they can't believe how happy everyone seems and how glad they are to be at work in such a challenging environment, and they can't believe how nicely they're welcomed and how calm it is. And it's all because we have these really effective relationships with each other, with the staff, with parents, with everyone who comes into the building. A friend of mine who's a lead psychologist at Goldsmiths calls it the cup of tea test. So, you're always judging everyone whenever you first meet them. And she judges every school she goes to by whether she's offered a cup of tea and how she's welcomed. Yeah. And so I've even introduced that into my recruitment strategy. So when I'm looking for new staff, which isn't very often, I have certain elements to that recruitment, include shortlisting, long listing, the ultimate interview, a lesson observation, but I'll also have several windows of opportunity So one of the first windows is when they arrive in the school. I'll ask the office staff, and I will weight it in terms of making it quantifiable. I will ask them how they felt that the individual spoke to them, because a lot of people often look down on the office staff, or those who they deem to be the bottom of the hierarchy. And then what I also did in my primary school a few years ago, I took one of the teaching assistants, and she sat with the candidates during their break, and I asked her to feedback on what newspapers they chose to read, what they talked about, whether they were welcoming, just so we got to find out a little bit more about how they ticked, what made them tick. Because I want to recruit on a values-based system. So as far as teaching goes, if I can teach anyone to teach, what I can't really effectively teach is people to understand, empathize, and be compassionate towards disadvantaged kids and have that resilience. I can support it, but it's more difficult if they're coming from a starting place that's a lot further back.
No, absolutely. And again, it's very similar in the corporate world around recruiting on attitude. Because on the skills of the job, you can train them, you can give them that support, but it's very difficult to change an attitude if they're coming in with that bad attitude. Transformation, we say all the time, transformation in any environment is typically very stressful for people, because people don't like to go through change, and you've seen things that many of us can't even imagine. So really, really stressful situations. But what do you do to manage your stress?
Yeah, lessons from the front line. So to manage my stress, a lot of it's around coaching and resilience. So I talk to other people, and I have a few good relationships with key people who understand what I'm talking about, who aren't linked into work. So I've got a good friend who is an executive head teacher down south, and I'll speak to them. So I have networks, and I also look after my physical health. And I don't know if I told you about the challenge that I'm doing at the moment. Yes. I'm running from London to Sarajevo, so it's 1,007 miles, and I'm doing that to raise awareness of the Bosnian genocide. I've got about 5 days left. Actually, I should hit Sarajevo on Saturday, the 31st of October.
Brilliant. And how many? What's that? Every day you're doing? What is it? 10 miles, is it, or something like
that? I think I've done about 255 days running every day. I've averaged a park run a day, so I'm averaging about 6 kilometers a day actually over the last 255 days.
Great, brilliant. And are you raising money for that? Is that something that we can all contribute to, or?
It's I wasn't trying to plug it, but I am. I'm trying to raise money to help tackle hatred for Remembering Srebrenica. So
well, send us the link, and I'll put the link in the show notes. So if anybody wants to contribute, that'd be great.
That's really kind. Thank you so much.
So one final question, it's the same question that I ask everybody on the podcast, is if you have to boil all your experience down into one core takeaway, what would that be?
Don't give up. Don't give up, and don't doubt that you can make a difference. So there's a social anthropologist called Margaret Mead who said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever can, or ever has. And so as a working class lad from Liverpool, I've never given up, and I've always woken up every day, no matter what negative thoughts intrude into my head. I always just think, no, I'm going to make a difference today. And so far I have.
That's great. Well, you can't really end on a more positive note than that. So thanks a lot. That's really great. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Cheers, Tony. You're very welcome.
Okay. Once we finished the podcast, Steve and I carried on our discussion, and his response to a point that I raised about his approach on coaching was so insightful, I was keen to share it with you. So here it is. I have not come across an organisation that does that coaching thing like you've done. Ever.
And you know what? So I'm a bit of a geek. I'm addicted to learning. So I've got 5 postgrad qualifications. I've got 2 master's degrees. I started a doctorate, but didn't have time to finish it because of all the charity work I do. But the master's I was doing was in coaching as an educational leadership tool. I did a big piece of research, and I just stopped and thought, there's never been a study that looks at staff happiness pupil happiness or staff well-being, pupil well-being and outcomes, but there is a bi-directional influence that also impacts on behaviour. And I just thought, you know what? Life's a bit shit sometimes. Life's tough. Work can be tough. So, talking about transformational change, on top of that, you've got stakeholders who will assault you. So you don't know what you're going to get every day. So I'm just gonna focus on supporting staff, supporting their emotional resilience. And one of the other things that we did, which has been incredibly useful, I do a lot of work around positive psychology, is every day at the end of the day when we have a staff meeting, we before we talk about what happened, what worked well, and what we need to work on to improve, you've got to turn to the person sitting next to you and tell them 3 things that went positively in the last 24 hours. Right. And most importantly, the reason why one of them happened. So you've got a sense of agency so you can do it again. So if something made you happy, why not do it again? And every time I go and do public talks and motivational speaking and all this sort of thing, that bit just changes the room. Everyone lights up. I can talk about the psychology behind it by Lubomirsky and all that sort of stuff. But I did this in a public forum for the Schools and Academies show last year. There's 150 speakers in the NEC, and there's me. And I just thought, no one's going to turn up. It was standing room only. Turns out they said I was the most popular speaker over 2 days out of the 150, and they turned it into a podcast, and it's their most downloaded podcast. It's just me with all these little nuggets of mad positivity, but it worked.
You need to share that podcast then, the address of that podcast.
Tony, I don't even know where it is. and the worst thing is, because I do suffer from imposter syndrome as a working class Scouser, I won't ever listen to myself. Right. So I've never read the 5-star review in my book. I won't read it. I just think someone's going to find me out. I don't actually belong here. So.
But I think everyone's got that imposter syndrome, haven't they? Yeah. Most people have, so I can understand it, but I don't think you've got anything to worry about.
Cheers, Tony.
Steve, once again, thank you. I'm sure that you'll agree with my premise that the way that Steve goes about transforming the lives of children in his schools, inmates in the prison that he supports, and the communities that he is working within can and should be deployed within organisations. Go try out his style of coaching and see how people respond. Give his idea of starting a meeting asking people to share what's been the best aspect of the last 24 hours and the reasons why, and gauge the difference. Please do share your experiences. You can connect direct with Steve within the Transformation Leaders Hub, along with many other project, program and change management professionals. The community is going from strength to strength. If you haven't checked it out already, please do so, and I look forward to seeing you in the clubhouse real soon.